Hello everybody and welcome back to another Marvel Crisis Protocol roster building episode. Last time on this series we created the tallest possible list, that being a roster where you could always field the fewest number of models possible, and today I figured we would kind of take that and reverse it. We're going to build the list that goes the widest possible, so we're going to put as many bodies on the table as possible. Now, there's a couple kind of different ways that you can approach a list like this, but for the purposes of specifically this video, we're going to have two things that we are going to be kind of measuring from. The first one is we have to be able to have a leadership ability active. The easiest way to do that is probably just going to be Emma. However, that is going to reduce the maximum number of models we can have on the board in that case, because Emma is of course only one model as a 4 threat, which is a little bit higher than what we would like our average threat level to be here. So unfortunately, we are going to have to lose a little bit of threat for that. I did consider some workarounds to this stuff like Fury, but unfortunately, Shield just doesn't have access to more than 1/2 threat, so it's really hard to make that work. Because of course Fury comes with the grunts, so you'd be able to kind of count him as 2 models still. That said, the second criteria here is not necessarily how many stat cards you have access to, but it is how many models are on the table. So if you have someone who has grunts, they do count as 2 models. So with that kind of out of the way, we're going to go ahead and get into building this roster here. And of course, to allow us to work with all of these low threat models that are part of a billion different affiliations, we are going to need Emma for this list. Emma is kind of necessary, just so we have a valid leadership for this roster. So that's going to be the first character we include. Now, if we want to go as wide as humanly possible, the obvious kind of threat level to look at is going to be the 20 threat level game, where we are going to be able to run Emma, so we have 16 threat remaining, and turns out there are enough 2 threats in the game that you could then run the remaining 16 threat in the form of 8 2 threats. So we're going to go ahead and filter here by threat level 2, and we're just going to grab every single 2 threat in the game, and we're going to take a look and see which ones suit the list best. And of course, the characters that are yet unreleased at the time of this video's recording coming up with a question mark, so they're showing up here as well, and so are grunts, but we're going to ignore those for this video. So the first ones we're going to include, we kind of have to make the decision of who we're cutting here, because there are 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 2 threats, so we got to cut one of them. And personally, I think the cut in this case, it's between either Widow, Bob, or Wong. Now, usually I love Wong. Wong is amazing, but the reason why I'd be considering cutting Wong in this case is because we don't really have a model we are going to get a lot of value out of a little bit of extra power or healing. Here, Wong is really good at supporting your higher threat models, but we're not going to be running any of those. So, in my opinion, Wong is the best one to cut. The argument for the other two, Widow is mainly just that Widow doesn't really specialize in anything, whereas all of the other 2 threats do. She's a great kind of just, anywhere she's affiliated, she's a very solid inclusion as a 2 threat. But in something like this, she's probably going to feel like the most lackluster model on the board in most of the games. So she doesn't really have much of a specific role or niche she can take. Bob is just in that case of a lot of the time he's kind of considered one of, if not the worst 2 threat, but I do actually kind of like him for something like this, because that rocket gives you some extra little oomph on hitting power that you don't have anywhere else in this list. So I do really like Bob. So for that reason, we are going to go ahead and include, for now, all 8 of these except for Wong. So that is bringing us to a 9 model roster, but of course we do have to factor in the fact that at odd threat levels, all of our models here are even, so we do need to be able to balance out for those odd threat levels, and for that we're going to bring Mr. Star-Lord along. And of course I have to undo the filter here to be able to see Mr. Star-Lord, so we'll go ahead and go back to that. And then we'll see Mr. Lord right here. So Star-Lord I'm bringing in for a couple of reasons. The main one being, if you guys have noticed, there are a couple of 2 threats here that share an affiliation. There's actually a couple affiliations that are shared amongst a couple here. I think A-Force is shared between Widow and Okoye, and then you have Cabal with Bob and Bullseye. So there are a couple of those bouncing around, but I think Guardians is one of the easier ones to make it work with one of the more generically useful leaderships, and it's of course on a 3-threat leader, which adds more to that as well. Obviously running the 6-threat leader for A-Force, or any of the 4-threat leaders for Cabal. We're going to pretend for a moment that they don't have a 3-threat leader, because let's be real, they don't, unfortunately. So I think it's just easier to squeeze in Star-Lord here, and it opens up some interesting possibilities at 15. So if you wanted to turn around and be like, hey, this is as wide as you could possibly get, this would be pretty much a completed roster. Boom, done. 5-minute video, super, super short. But I think there's something slightly more interesting we can do, because we said the number of models on the board is our criteria for widest possible list. Now, you can take any 4-threat character that comes with grunts, such as Elektra or Shadowland Daredevil, or Nick Fury, as we mentioned earlier with Shield. And you can bring in their grunts, and you can say, okay, well that's a 4-threat model replacing two threats in the list for the same number of bodies on the board. Those are super super valid. And I think if you wanted to try and optimize this list, you could bring any of them in for any of these 2-threat slots here and play around with that, and you're still not losing or gaining more models on the board. So I think that's great. If you are going for the stat card play, I think this is the kind of perfect point of you have as many stat cards as you're going to be able to put on the table at any given time in this roster here. But I think the most interesting thing you can do is to sub out one of these 2 threats for, instead of any of those grunt carriers, specifically Sandman. So for those who have not played with or against Sandman, Sandman is unique amongst the kind of grunt leaders in the form of he is able to have 2 sand constructs in play rather than 1, and they are grunts. They do count as characters for 99% of the rules in the game. They do count as bodies on the board. They're not like Magneto, where you're just putting down these little pieces of terrain. These actually interact with everything else like characters do. So they kind of count as full-fledged characters. So for 4-threat, we can replace 2 2-threats in a list and get 3 models out of it, which is obviously really, really good for the point of this list. Now, when it comes to who to remove, I already kind of shown my opinions on who has the kind of bottom cuts on this list. And I do really like the idea of just having Bob's Rocket in your back pocket for just when you need to be able to say, okay, something needs to die here and I don't have the hitting power to do it. So for that reason, I am going to choose to cut Widow from the list here in favor of Sandman, because yeah, having access to those grunts is going to give you a lot of flexibility at some threat levels. So Sandman is going to make the cut here, and that is going to be our list of 10 models. So we're going to go ahead and start taking a look at tactics cards next. All right, so going into tactics cards, the first thing we're going to take is, of course, Emma's leadership. Now, that is going to take one of our restricted slots, which is rather unfortunate, seeing as our restricted slots are going to be relatively precious, with so few characters that actually have their own cards. And of course, that being our leadership, we don't have much in the way of affiliated cards either. However, we did mention the possibility to run Guardians of the Galaxy at lower threat levels, so we are going to factor that in here as well, because of course we do have Star-Lord as an alternative leader. So we're going to be able to take some Guardians cards to hopefully help fill that out. So taking a look at our Guardians cards here, I think it's worth just including both of them. If crew was included, I would probably throw that in there as well. I don't think we're going to be tight on tactics card slots with this list, and I think both these cards can get a lot of mileage. Galaxy's Greatest is going to make those 2 threats feel like they are much bigger than 2 threats, and you combine that with Wingets and stuff like that and potentially be really, really good. And Level Misfits on 3 characters is still quite solid, so we're going to include both of the Guardians cards here because, yeah, they're both pretty solid. For our second restricted slot, we are going to take Brace for Impact, just because most throws of even, just like size 3 terrain just has the potential to one-shot most of our characters, so being able to stop that from happening at least once is going to be relatively helpful. There's also an argument probably for something like Sacrifice, but in the 2 threats, we do have a Taunt and a Bodyguard, so we already have a little bit of that rolling around. And something like Patch Up, I don't think you get quite as much value out of most of the 2 threats, so it's probably not worth bringing in a case like this. So that is going to be our restricted cards and our affiliation cards. So next we got to start looking at some character cards. All right, so the first card we're going to take a look at here is Mind Transfer. Mind Transfer is going to be an interesting one here. I mean, it's a card that you don't see too much competitively, but I think it's worth including here just because being able to play with our opponent's activations and, who's activating and when they're activating could potentially be really valuable in a list like this, especially if they have a model that's kind of like a meat grinder that you really want to be able to, force to go at certain times and things like that by threatening with this card. So I think it could potentially be really interesting, and I think we're going to have the card slots for it, so it's worth including in the list here, whether it ends up being that useful or not. The other card we're going to include here for character cards is Jonathan the Unstoppable. This is just going to allow you to kind of keep some pace on the secure objectives a little bit harder because you're running a lot of 2 threats, so a lot of the times your models are going to be sitting on their injured side, or they're going to be relatively easy to daze and take off of points. So being able to put this on a point, especially with one of the models that can't contest points otherwise, is going to be relatively nice to just kind of be able to help keep up with that. And also, you can kind of abandon your back point this way and stuff like that. So yeah, I think in general, this is just a reasonably solid card, and yeah, worth including in this case. So we'll throw that in there too. All right, from here, we only have 4 slots left, so I think it's time to just start looking at some of the generically good cards. And I think one of the first ones we're going to include is Fallback here. Fallback might not be as useful as it would be in a normal list because we don't have as many models with large health pools that are going to be taking as many attacks to go down, but it's still a really strong card, so I think it's definitely worth including, whether we can get full value out of it or not. So I think that one's going to be really good. Another one that I think is really worth considering in a list this wide is something like Joint Effort, because obviously we have a lot of models on the board, even at lower threats. You're going to be able to get a lot of extra dice out of this, and it's all about, with this list, making your 2 threats feel like they are much bigger than 2 threats, and this card's going to help with that in a big way. So I think Joint Effort is kind of a no-brainer with a list like this. All right, with our last couple cards, I think we can have some fun with these ones. And one of the ones that I want to include here is Venomized. I think this card is potentially super interesting on a list like this because you are putting access to a pretty solid spender on a 2 threat, and this is something I've kind of been theorizing might be interesting from the start of the game. Whether or not it's worth a card slot in your standard list is a different story, but I think being able to kind of throw an attack like this onto a 2 threat that usually doesn't hit all that hard, and in a lot of the discussions I've had around this, I've been thinking about stuff like Wong. I think it could be really interesting. So we're going to try that out with this list and see how it feels. But obviously, that might be one of those that one's for fun, not necessarily a competitive choice. But that's not really what this list is about. So yeah, we're going for that one there. And the last one we're going to include, I think, is just Recalibration Matrix. We're not throwing particularly large dice pools, so I don't think we're going to get too much value out of this, but it might help stop some spikes into us, which is pretty solid. But yeah, honestly, I was just kind of running out of card options here, and this is just a generically good card, so probably worth including. And yeah, that does bring us to our full list of 10 tactics cards here. So we're going to go ahead and start on Crisis Selection. Starting out with the extracts here, I think we want to play to the strength of the list. So on one hand, we want scenarios where there's a lot of points to pick up because obviously we have a lot of models to do that with. So we want to be able to take full advantage of that sort of situation. On the other hand, we also want the higher threats because the whole point of this list is to put as many bodies on the table as humanly possible. So even though at higher threats, that's actually less effective for us than it is with a lower threat game where your opponent is going to feel a lot more restricted by that. I think we want to be able to kind of play the point of the list and play at 20 threat as often as humanly possible. So I think Skrulls is going to get a spot just for that reason, and it is a good number of objectives. The one downside to that is, of course, most of our models don't have the best defensive stats in the world, so they're very likely to be getting pushed and punished for those objectives. So that is something we're going to have to keep in mind. But on the other hand, if our opponent's getting pushed and potentially punished by their objectives, we can also really take advantage of that with some of our more offensive models like Nebula and stuff like that. So yeah, I think we'll include that there, and then I think we're also going to take Senators just because lots of objectives we'll be able to catch, a bunch of those. So hopefully we can take advantage of just the sheer numbers on that one as well. So I think those are the first two, and those are relatively straightforward, obvious ones there. From there, I think there's a few solid options. I mean, something like cubes could be really interesting, being able to, we We are expecting to die quickly anyways, so taking a damage or two here and there for some extra power is probably a pretty good trade-off for us, so I think that could be really interesting. Hammers to help us punch above our weight, that could also be really interesting. Something like Paranoia, again, we're just going to take advantage of the fact that we have a lot of bodies on the board, so we're always going to get those bonuses and things like that. All really, really good options. Personally, I think I'm leaning towards hammers. Being able to hit a little bit harder with these models is probably going to feel really, really nice. And, you know, we're already kind of expecting to be one or two shot by most attacks, so giving our opponent an extra die probably doesn't hurt us too badly. So, yeah, I think we're going to go with hammers for our last one there, and yeah, that is our extract selection. Okay, so going into secures, I am going to throw a slight curveball in here, and that is I am going to pick a 15 threat secure in the form of sword base, because 15 threat is where we're going to be able to run our Guardians of the Galaxy list, which we're going to show when we go to the breakdowns and things like that. And yeah, I think our Guardians of the Galaxy at 15 will absolutely demolish everything on this map. I think this could be really, really interesting. So yeah, we're gonna include that in there, even though I know I said earlier that we want to include the higher threat things, but we're immediately gonna make up for that by also including scoundrels, because we're gonna get cover, which is actually gonna make us kind of obnoxious to take down, and yeah, that's just solid. So no notes on that one there, but yeah, I do really like that one. From there, honestly, I think you could kind of get away with most of the different objective types available here. I'd be really interested to see how a list like this would perform on an EMAP. I think it could perform really, really well in like the first or second round, where you're going to have that anti-priority, so you're going to be able to put the last like two or three bodies on the point even because you're running way wider than your opponent is, and score a bunch of points that way. But then you're going to have the downside of, as that game goes on, your stuff is just going to die because you can't run away because you have to stay in the middle to score the points. So it's an interesting one. I'd be curious to see how it plays, but I'd pick a lot of EMAPs, so we're going to avoid that for this one. And yeah, I really don't know what the best option here would be. I don't think I want to give something like Extremis where my opponents can be able to heal off of that and get a lot of value out of that when we're trying to probably do a lot of death by a thousand cuts style things here with all of our weaker attacks and things like that. So we don't want that. Honestly, I think I might just lean towards something like Infinity Formula. Give a little bit of power to our entire team. We can really take advantage of that and get a ton of power across the many different models we're running. So I think I'm going to go for Formula for this one, as that might be a bit of a curveball, but yeah, I think it'll be at the very least interesting. Alrighty, so there we have our final list. So our 10 characters include Emma, Sandman, Star-Lord, Bob, Bullseye, Honey Badger, Okoye, Nebula, Rocket, and Toad. And of course we have the Sand Construct Grunts that we'll be bringing in with Mr. Sandman here. For tactics cards, of course, we have Emma's leadership. That's going to be relatively important. And our other restricted slot is taken up by Brace here. Going into other affiliated cards, we have Galaxy's Greatest and Lovable Misfits for Guardians specifically. For character cards, we got Mind Transfer for Emma and Jonathan the Unstoppable for Honey Badger. And then we have a few generics here that we're going to be able to play in all of the games, including Fallback, Joint Effort, Venomized, and Recalibration Matrix. Going into Crises, our extracts include Skrulls, Mutant Extremists target U.S. Senators, and Fear grips world as worthy terrorize cities. And in the secure side of things, we got Sword Base, Superpowered Scoundrels, and Infinity Formula. So yeah, I'm actually pretty happy with this. I'd be curious to try this out and see how this actually does in a competitive setting. I know a couple players who have tried something like this before and actually seen a surprising amount of success with it, because sometimes if you just throw enough bodies at your opponent, they don't know what to do about it. So I think it could potentially work in, maybe not necessarily the big events or anything like that, but at some local events, this could be a really fun list that potentially actually has some legs to it. But one thing I really do want to go over with a list like this is, of course, the breakdowns, so we're going to take a look at those. Alright, so right out the gate, going out the breakdown, you can see we have a ton of options at many of the different threats. Funny enough, 20 threat is where we have the fewest possible options, which kind of makes a lot of sense, actually. So, of course, with Emma as the leader, we can hit a few different options here. And, of course, remember that Sandman counts as 3 models for the purposes of this. So, right out the gate here, we're seeing, 7 models on the board. with any of these variants that include Sandman at 15 here. Now, of course, two of those models can't contest or secure objectives, those being the sand constructs, and if you're including Nebula, Honey Badger, or both, that becomes even more so, and of course these are all just slight variants on the same thing. Here we go, without Sandman, you can get 6 models, so you could potentially run 6 models that can contest objectives. I think that's this one right here. You have 6 different models that can all play the objective game, potentially really, really interesting, but of course including Sandman is how you do this with the widest possible threat. So yeah, that's obviously going to be a thing right there. You can really take advantage of being able to use Sandman to go super wide if you need to go wider for attrition reasons, or if you're trying to play the scoring game, you can take 6 scoring models, which is obviously a big deal. I also just wanted to highlight our Guardians of the Galaxy roster here, which is Emma, Sandman, Star-Lord, Nebula, and Rocket. Now, it is exactly this roster. There's no change you can make to this roster, but at 15 threat on the map where this is available, you have 4 models that can play the points. You're running 5 models wide, but actually it's 7 because of Sandman. Of course, 3 of those models can't contest the objectives because you are running Nebula, but that's a lot of bodies for your opponent to deal with at 15 threat, and I think this list plays specifically sword base really, really well. So I'd be very curious to try this out and see how it works. Yeah, I just think this could potentially be a really solid list at 15. Obviously, it's not as good as Guardian's normal 15 threat, but for a list like this, it gives you kind of some cool versatility at that lower threat value. So yeah, just something interesting worth acknowledging there. All right, but the breakdown I think people are really interested to see is how many models can we put on the table? And, well, we have 7 different options at 20 threat, and all it is basically just cycling out which 2 threat isn't included, but we are including 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 2 threats in all of these, 7 when you get to Emma, 8 when you get to Sandman, and then you have 2 grunts, bringing you up to 10 models on the board. Absolutely insane. That's a lot of models. Obviously they're all squishier models, but it is definitely one of those things where you throw that down against an opponent, they're gonna have to spend a minute of just being like, wait a minute, what am I looking at here? How do I deal with this? Because it's a lot of stuff. And yeah, I genuinely want to try this out. I think this would be a really fun list to just kind of plop down and be like, hey, how do you feel about going up against 10 models? Just kind of insane. But yeah, that is what that is. And as you can see, we have tons of options at all of the different threat levels. I filtered it out, so it's only showing us the ones that are actually affiliated somewhere, so only the options that have Emma. So you may notice the numbers are a little bit lower than they would have been previously, but there's still tons of them. I mean, you have 50 options at 17 threat. Now, you know, admittedly, a lot of these are just cycling out 2 threats and things like that, but still, you have so many choices at every threat value. It's kind of insane, but yeah, I actually think this would be a really, really fun list to play, and I'm glad I threw it together. I might try to throw either the 15 or the 20 threat down for a battle report at some point on the channel, because I think both of those are really, really interesting lists that potentially just pose a really unique game to your opponent. And yeah, I'd be curious to play that game. But that is going to do it for this roster building video. Definitely let me know what you guys think down below in the comments. How you guys might have approached this differently, if there's models you would have included that I didn't include. Did I miss something obvious? Is there a way to go 11 models wide at 20 threat? Definitely let me know if I missed something like that, because I would be very, very curious to see if you can actually go wider than this list. I think you know, I think I got the widest you can go, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I missed something. Obviously, there's also versions of this where, you know, maybe you're not counting grunts, so Sandman should actually be 2 threats or something like that. Does take away the ability to use Star-Lord's leadership at 15, so then you switch out Star-Lord maybe for a more universally solid 3 versus Star-Lord, who I think most of the time you're going to want to run him as the leader. If you're running him, obviously you're going to have to make that sacrifice at 17 threat and 19 threat. But is what it is. So I'd definitely be curious to hear how you guys would approach building a similar list in the comments section below. So please do let me know, because I really want to see what kind of variants of this could exist. But that is going to do it for me for this one. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, please do drop a like down below. Subscribe if you're new to the channel. We do more discussion focused content like this during the weekdays, and we have battle reports on the weekends. So if you're a fan of any of that sort of thing, feel free to jump on in. That's going to do it for this one, though. So until next time, have a great day, everybody. Peace.